She thought she was going to die. The sun beat down on the Nevada dust as she stood barefoot and trembling in the center of the circle. 14 cowboys, rifles slung low, boots scuffing dry earth, said nothing. The war had ended, but in this moment it felt like something far worse was just beginning. Her uniform still bore the faded insignia of the Imperial Army. Her hands were raw from transport chains. She had no name to these men, only a nationality, an enemy, a woman, alone, surrounded. And then something strange happened. One man stepped forward, older, lined face, soft eyes, and held out a glass bottle filled with water. Not a bullet, not a boot, but water. She flinched. He didn't move, and slowly the others followed. A blanket, a biscuit, a word in broken Japanese. Okay. The circle opened. Kindness, where she had expected cruelty. It would be weeks before she spoke, months before she laughed. But that moment cracked everything. The dust barely settled when the bottle left his hand. It clinked softly as it touched the ground in front of her, its contents sloshing under the heat. She didn't move. Her knees threatened to give, but pride, or fear, held her upright. Around her the 14 men stood still as posts, hands dangling near holstered pistols or gripping leather belts. Their hats shaded their expressions, but their body language told her everything. Uncertain, guarded, but not hostile. She had expected fury, spittle, perhaps even blood. Not this. Not silence so thick it pressed against her chest harder than a rifle ever could. Her heart raced with the animal rhythm of prey. Every breath shallow, every limb poised for the impact that hadn't yet come. She didn't know if this was a game, a trick, or the prelude to humiliation. She had been told what Americans did to captured women. She had believed it, until now. One of them shifted his weight, boots crunching gravel, and she flinched instinctively. His hands didn't rise. Instead, he crouched, slow and low, like he was trying not to startle a wounded horse, and nudged the bottle an inch closer. His eyes met hers for a split second. Not dominance, not pity. Something quieter, a kind of puzzled concern. She didn't understand it. A minute passed, maybe more. Time bent beneath the sun. Then another man stepped forward, pulled a woolen blanket from his saddlebag, and held it out. She didn't take it, couldn't. Still, he laid it gently on a rock beside her. A third reached into his vest and pulled out something wrapped in wax paper, a square of cornbread or biscuit, and placed it near the bottle. No words, no orders, just offerings, as though she were some skittish god fallen from the sky, and they didn't know what ritual would keep her from vanishing. Her legs gave out before her mind did. One moment she was standing, the next the earth met her body in a collapse of bones and breath. The closest cowboy rushed forward without thinking. She didn't resist. She couldn't. Her limbs refused to obey. The strength had drained from her muscles, leaving only the trembling wreckage of what fear and hunger had made of her. The man paused beside her, hands hovering awkwardly, unsure whether to touch or leave her be. Then he looked over his shoulder, wordlessly asking the others what to do. The older man, the one who'd offered the water, gave a small nod. They lifted her together. Rough hands, but not cruel. One supported her back. Another kept her legs from dragging in the dust. Her eyes stayed wide, unblinking, as the sky wobbled above. No words were exchanged as they carried her toward the bunkhouse, a squat wooden structure near the edge of the ranch. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of leather, hay, and tobacco. A cot stood in the corner, thin mattress spread with a wool blanket. They laid her down gently. One of the younger men tucked the canteen into her hands, closed her fingers around it, and then stepped back. The door creaked shut behind them. Alone now, she stared at the beams overhead, unable to make sense of what had just happened. Her whole life had led her to expect monsters. Instead, they'd carried her like something breakable. The water touched her lips like a question. She drank. Slowly, then let the canteen fall beside her. Her fingers found the coarse edge of the blanket. For a moment she gripped it like a lifeline. Outside, the cowboys gathered under the porch awning, boots scraping wood, faces furrowed. They didn't talk much. Some lit cigarettes. Others stared out toward the hills. None of them had planned for this. A prisoner of war, a woman, and a Japanese one at that, here on American soil, among ranch hands and horses. One finally muttered, "Hell of a thing." The others nodded. One spit into the dirt, another scratched his neck. And then the oldest among them, the one who'd first stepped forward, said simply, "She ain't our enemy no more. She's just lost." Inside, beneath the blanket, she lay awake and listened. Her body ached, her pride was raw, and yet something, some small corner of her soul, began to loosen its grip on the old fears. Not because she trusted them, not yet, but because, for the first time since capture, she wasn't afraid to close her eyes. They called her the Ghost, because that's what she became. A shape under a blanket, barely moving, barely breathing. She didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't ask for anything. For days, she curled against the wooden wall of the bunkhouse, her knees pulled to her chest, eyes hollow and far away. The blanket never left her shoulders, and she clutched it like it might vanish, like everything else had. Each morning, someone left food on a small table by her cot. Biscuits, sometimes a tin plate of beans or bread with butter. Each evening, the food sat untouched. The men started betting on it, quietly, whether today would be the day she'd take a bite. They lost every time. When the door opened, she flinched, even if it was just the breeze. Every bootstep set her on edge. Her ears had grown so trained to shouts and orders, to the sharp bark of commands, that even silence was suspect. She didn't understand this new rhythm, the gentle coughs before someone entered, the way they knocked even when they didn't have to. The space was shared with two of the younger ranch hands, boys no older than she was when the war began. They tiptoed around her like she was made of glass. One night, one of them left a carved horse figurine on her bedside, made from driftwood. He said nothing. She never touched it. But she didn't throw it away, either. To the cowboys, she was a mystery, wrapped in silence. They'd fought in the Pacific, or lost kin there, or sent off cousins and never saw them again. And yet none of them could bring themselves to hate her, not fully. Perhaps it was the way she folded herself so tightly, as if trying to disappear. Or maybe it was the silence, the way she never once looked anyone in the eye, never made a sound unless startled. It didn't feel like defiance, it felt like defeat, and that, somehow, was harder to bear. She wasn't a prisoner chained to a fence post or a woman spitting fire. She was a ghost in a corner, haunting a bunkhouse in the middle of nowhere. They tried to talk to her at first, slow, clear English. One even pulled out a dog-eared phrase book from the war, mangled a greeting in Japanese. She blinked, didn't respond. They tried drawing pictures, a sun, a horse, a steaming bowl of stew. Nothing. It wasn't that she didn't understand. She did, but understanding had brought her nothing but pain, so she pretended not to. That was easier. Then came the chili. On the fourth day, one of the older men, the same one who'd offered the water, brought in a steaming bowl rich with the smell of cumin and slow-simmered beef. He didn't say anything. He didn't look at her. He just set it down, left a spoon beside it, and walked out. The door creaked, then silence. She stared at it. The steam curled upward like smoke from a memory. Her stomach twisted. She had survived on moldy rice, thin gruel, and hard rations. Meat was not food, it was a memory. But the smell, it undid her, not with hunger, with grief. Hours passed, the bowl cooled, the spoon stayed where it was. The men figured it was another loss. But just before dusk, when the bunkhouse was empty, and the cicadas screamed through the desert heat, she reached forward with a trembling hand. Her fingers closed around the spoon. Her wrist shook. She took a bite. The taste nearly knocked her breath from her chest. It was warmth, salt, meat, spice. It hit her like a wave, not just on the tongue, but in the chest. A memory of life. Her throat burned and tears sprang uninvited to her eyes. She didn't cry, she didn't make a sound, but she took another bite, then another. When the men returned, they said nothing about the empty bowl on the table. But one of them, just before lights out, left another one on her cot. This time it was still warm, and for the first time since the desert, she looked up. Just for a second. Her eyes met his. Not a smile, not gratitude, just the faintest nod. Like a truce, like the ghost had decided to linger just a little longer in the world of the living. Before she became the ghost in the bunkhouse, she was someone else. Someone with a name, a family, a country that promised her greatness, if only she obeyed without question. In the narrow alleys of Kyoto, where paper lanterns swayed in the wind and temple bells echoed at dusk, she was once a girl kneeling before her father as he recited the Bushido Code. Death before dishonor. It was not just a phrase, it was marrow, woven into breath and blood. School books didn't speak of defeat, only duty. Her classroom walls were hung with posters of the emperor, painted like a god. She wore her uniform with pride, a red cross stitched to her arm, and whispered the oath every morning. Better to fall by your own hand than be touched by the enemy's. In training, they taught her more than medicine. They taught her to fear. Stories passed between young nurses like prayers, of captured women, mutilated, of American soldiers who laughed while cutting open bellies. No one ever questioned these stories. Fear was not irrational. It was righteous. It kept you pure. So when the bombs began falling in Manila and the hospital collapsed around her, she ran, not from death, but from the shame of living through capture. But they caught her. She remembered the mud on her knees, the weight of a boot near her neck, the shouting in a language she didn't understand. She waited for pain, for punishment, for the stories to become real. Instead, they gave her water. That was the first fracture. From there, her journey twisted through holding stations and guarded trains, barbed wire fences and language she couldn't decode. She slept in tents with straw mats, watched other prisoners cry in silence, scream in their sleep, stare blankly at nothing. No one spoke much. Some still believed they'd be executed any day. She was among them. It was only a matter of time. One woman from Nagasaki tried to claw through a fence on the third night. Her hands bled until they were wrapped in American gauze. The guards were strange, not cruel, not kind, just impossibly indifferent. They handed out food, issued clean socks, wrote things down in neat columns. The procedure itself was disorienting. She was used to chaos, to orders barked through clenched teeth. Here, things moved slowly, deliberately, like every step had been practiced 1,000 times. She expected a whip. She received a clipboard. When she was finally loaded onto a ship bound for the mainland, she had already begun to unravel inside. But the true disorientation began once she reached American soil. She didn't know where she was, only that the sun was cruel, the wind tasted of salt and dust, and the men who met her wore cowboy hats and smelled of tobacco. No one spat on her, no one shouted. They escorted her like a package, not a prisoner. She was assigned a number, given a cot, a bar of soap, a toothbrush, and then the fork. It came with a plate of eggs and something that looked like meat but smelled like sweetness. She stared at the utensils like they were weapons. She had expected to be starved, paraded through streets, forced to crawl. Instead, someone motioned toward the plate with a short nod. Just eat. That's all they wanted. She didn't touch it. Not then. But something began to break. Slowly, quietly, in the corners of her mind, in the silence of each passing day. A bandage applied to her wrist, a shirt handed to her after the sun burned her arms, a cowboy who said okay with a shrug, as if that word alone could translate what entire governments had failed to. Each gesture chipped away at the mythology she had been fed since childhood. The Americans were not devils with bayonets between their teeth. They were men who listened to radios, who chewed toothpicks, who didn't seem to care that she had once worn the uniform of their enemy. That was harder to bear than hatred. Hatred made sense. This indifference wrapped in decency, felt like a betrayal of everything she had been taught. And yet it drew her in, like warmth toward frostbitten skin. She didn't understand the war anymore, and more terrifying than that, she wasn't sure she ever had. The men didn't either, not fully, not anymore. They were ranch hands and horsebreakers, sons of dust and distance who had been told what to fight for, but not how to live afterward. Some had tried enlisting when the news from Pearl Harbor lit up every bar in the West, but many were turned away or deferred. Flat feet, bad backs, ailing fathers needing help on the ranch. Others had gone, cousins, brothers, best friends from school. Most didn't return, and those who did came back different. One man, Tommy, received a letter every few weeks from his older brother who had fought in Okinawa. The last one was short. Fewer than 10 words. I can't sleep. The island won't leave my head. After that, nothing. So no. They weren't saints. They didn't carry halos. They carried scars they didn't talk about, wounds that looked like long stares into the horizon or too much time polishing saddles that were already clean. And when she arrived, this quiet woman wrapped in silence, they didn't know what to make of her. She was the face of something they had been taught to fear and hate, but she was also just a girl, thin, pale, bruised in places you couldn't see, and she never once raised her voice or met their eyes. At first, they kept their distance. She haunted the bunkhouse like a storm cloud that refused to rain. The space was tight, the air tense. The men took turns sleeping in the barn just to give her room. They whispered about it, not cruelly, but with a sort of puzzled care, like ranchers trying to handle an animal they'd never seen before. No one said she didn't belong, but no one said what she was doing there either. It was just a fact, like the heat or the dust. She existed. They worked around her. She startled easily. One of the boys, Jimmy, forgot and slammed the door behind him one night. She jolted so hard she knocked over her tin cup. He spent the rest of the evening quietly mending the handle with wire and glue, setting it back on her table without a word. Another time, she burned her fingers trying to light a match. Hank, the grizzled cook with hands like bark, showed her how to cup the flame away from the wind. He didn't explain it. He just demonstrated it once, twice, and then handed her the matchbox. She nodded. He nodded back. The smallest kindnesses began to accumulate like dust on boots. One afternoon, while the others were out mending fence posts, Levi, the youngest, barely 20, brought her a spoon, not just to give, but to teach. She had been using it backwards, holding it like chopsticks. He knelt beside her and mimed the motion slowly, scooping air, then miming a bite. She blinked, then mirrored him. Their eyes met for a moment. No smile. But the lesson stayed. That night she used it the right way. Books came next. Someone left a stack of paperbacks near her cot. Westerns, mostly. Cowboy pulp with yellowed pages and covers of horses mid-gallop. One had a broken spine, another a note inside. Good. One. Sad ending. She didn't know what the words meant, not all of them, but she traced the letters with her finger. Symbols that once meant war now carried something softer. They smelled of leather and tobacco, these men, of saddle oil and sweat and the sun itself. They weren't clean-shaven or clean-spoken, but their cruelty, if they had any, had long since dried out under the desert sun. What they offered wasn't apology. It was proximity, space, a fork, a book. The silence between enemies, slowly filling with something that wasn't quite peace, but was no longer war either. And that was a start. She rose before dawn, not because she was asked, not because of orders or obligation. Something inside her simply shifted, a silent tilt, like a door creaking open in the mind. The air outside was still cool, the sky still purple with sleep. She moved like a shadow, barefoot over the wooden floor, blanket still draped around her shoulders. The cook's tent glowed dimly from a lantern inside. She hesitated, just for a breath, then stepped in. Hank was already at the stove, muttering under his breath and flipping strips of bacon that hissed and curled in the pan. He looked up, startled, when she entered. Her presence, once ghost-like, now felt human, real in a way that couldn't be ignored. She said nothing, just walked to the small table where a pile of onions waited to be peeled. She reached for a knife. He didn't stop her. She peeled them with practiced speed, eyes stinging but hands steady. Years ago she'd done this for men who bled in caves, whose bodies reeked of rot and jungle. Back then, food was rationed like mercy, thin, gray, barely warm. Even a sliver of boiled root could mean life or death. She'd crushed rice with bruised fingers and held tin cups to the lips of dying boys. They never said thank you. There wasn't time. You fed who you could, and when they died, you fed the next one. That was how it worked. Now here she was, cutting onions in the tent of a man whose country had bombed hers to dust. Hank didn't speak. He just slid a bowl toward her and gestured to the eggs. She cracked them cleanly, one after another, into a tin bowl. He watched, quiet, smoke curling from his cigarette. When she finished, he handed her a whisk. Their hands brushed, a jolt, then stillness. She looked up. He nodded. She whisked. The smell of the cooking spread across the camp, rich and thick, eggs, onions, pork fat. The others emerged slowly, rubbing sleep from their eyes, boots scuffing the dirt. When they saw her in the kitchen tent, some stopped mid-step. Jimmy frowned. Levi looked confused. One of the older men muttered something under his breath, not cruel, but uncertain. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did and chose not to care. Breakfast was served in silence. Plates passed down the line. Coffee poured. No one made a scene. But they all felt it. The shift. The ghost had cooked. The ghost had fed them. It wasn't forgiveness. It was more dangerous than that. It was recognition. The act of feeding, once a duty to soldiers in bunkers, now bridged a chasm between enemy and neighbor. Later that morning, Levi whispered to Hank, "Why'd you let her in?" Hank shrugged. "She knew what she was doing." "Still," Levi said, not finishing the thought. "Still," Hank echoed, eyes fixed on the horizon. Then, quieter, "Can't eat hatred every day and not go hungry." And so the camp changed, subtly. One breakfast didn't erase scars, but it rewrote a morning. The plates were emptied, the pans washed, and the men saddled up to work. But they looked at her differently now, not with trust, not yet, but with something slower, steadier. Perhaps the first ember of it. And she, standing by the tent flap with flour on her hands, watched them go. The dust from their boots curled into the morning light, and for the first time she felt something rise in her chest, not fear, not grief, something closer to belonging, or the very beginning of it. She still didn't speak their language, not in sentences, but it no longer mattered. Words were only one kind of understanding. The rest, the real part, was built in glances, gestures, pauses that held weight. Communication had become a kind of choreography. A tilt of the head meant yes, a narrowed brow, no. When she touched her fingers to her chest, it meant me. When she pointed to the rising sun and smiled faintly, the others understood she was saying something about beginnings. They started small. Jimmy, with a stick and the dusty earth as his chalkboard, scratched out the word water, then pointed to the tin canteen. "Water," he repeated slowly. She looked, blinked, then repeated it, quiet but clear. He grinned, startled by how soft her voice was when it came. The next day, it was thank you. The day after that, sun. Levi even tried coffee, which made her wrinkle her nose, and that made them laugh. It was the first time her expression had carried something like humor. In return, she taught nothing formally, but her hands spoke volumes. She drew in the dirt with sticks or stones, little sketches that hinted at memory. One morning, beside the bunkhouse, she etched a house with a slanted roof, a garden, a woman in a kimono with 2 children. No one needed translation. It was home. Another time, she drew a mountain, perfectly triangular. "Fuji," she whispered, and the name hung there like a flag. A few days later, she scratched out a line of dots, bombs falling, and tiny stick figures running beneath them. She didn't speak when she did that. No one did. The drawing said enough. Her past, their past. It bled into the dirt, softening hard lines, revealing the ways in which pain crossed borders more easily than armies ever could. The Cowboys stopped trying to teach her nouns after that. They just let her draw, let her share what she could, how she could. One evening, after supper, the bunkhouse glowed gold in the fading light. Dust swirled lazily through the beams. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned after a long day's work. That's when Hank pulled out the music box. He said it had belonged to his mother, mailed to him after she passed. He never opened it before, just carried it around like a talisman. He set it on the table, wound the key. The tune was faint but clear, something old, sweet and lilting, a waltz maybe, the kind you'd hear at a county fair. At first, no one reacted. Then she looked up from where she sat, eyes wide, as if something invisible had entered the room. Music was rare in the places she had come from. Music had been the sound of radios crackling before bombs. But this was something else. A lullaby, a memory. She didn't cry, but her fingers found the edge of the table, and she leaned in closer. The tune twirled through the bunkhouse like a breeze through lace curtains. No one spoke. No one dared. When the song ended, she looked at Hank. Slowly, she placed her hand on her heart, bowed her head slightly. It was not Japanese. It was not English. It was something older than either, a gesture born of gratitude and mourning. That night, no one said a word about the music box, but when Hank packed it away, he handed it to her first. Let her touch it. Feel the metal. See the winding key. The next morning, she drew a new picture in the dust. It was a bird, and beside it, 3 letters scratched with care. FLY. The mail arrived just after sunrise, carried in the battered hands of a supply driver who smelled of oil and long roads. Letters were rare out here, and when they came, they were usually for the men. Envelopes smudged with dust, folded too many times, carrying news from wives, mothers, towns that still existed somewhere beyond the desert. This one was different, smaller, lighter, stamped with an American insignia she had learned to recognize. Her name, carefully typed, awkward in Roman letters, sat alone on the front. She stared at it as if it might explode. No one spoke. Hank cleared his throat. Levi looked away. Jimmy pretended to tighten a saddle strap that didn't need tightening. They had seen letters do damage before. They knew the weight a piece of paper could carry. Finally, Hank placed it gently on the table beside her bowl. She didn't reach for it at first. Her hands trembled, hovering just above the envelope. The past pressed in from all sides, the camps, the ship, the endless waiting. She had written once, months earlier, in careful characters, unsure if the letter would ever leave the fence. She had written simply, "I am alive." Nothing more, no details, no hope, just a fact, sent into the dark like a bottle into the sea. Now the sea had answered. She broke the seal slowly. The paper inside was thin, official, written in Japanese by an American translator. The words swam before her eyes. She read them once, then again. Her breath hitched, her knees buckled. She collapsed. Not gently, not quietly. Her body folded inward as if something essential had been removed. The letter slid from her fingers to the dirt. Jimmy moved instinctively, but Hank raised a hand, stopping him. This wasn't something to rush. This was grief finding its way out. She wept then, not the silent tears she had swallowed for months, but deep, shuddering sobs that tore through her chest and left her gasping. Her shoulders shook, her face crumpled. The sound startled the horses in the corral. It startled the men more. The letter said her family believed she was dead. The letter said her hometown no longer existed, flattened by firebombs, its name now spoken only in records and apologies. The letter said there would be no reply. She rocked back and forth, clutching at nothing. Everything she had carried inside her, the discipline, the restraint, the belief that she could return to something familiar, collapsed in that moment. There was no bridge left between who she had been and who she was now. Only ash. Hank sat down beside her. He didn't touch her, didn't speak. He just sat, solid and quiet, like a fence post driven deep into the earth. After a while, her sobs slowed. Her breathing steadied. She leaned almost unconsciously toward him, not against him, just close enough to know someone was there. Minutes passed, maybe longer. When she finally looked up, her face was wet and raw, eyes swollen but clear in a way they hadn't been before. She picked up the letter again, folded it carefully, pressed it to her chest. That night, long after supper, she did something none of them expected. She stood alone in the bunkhouse, lantern light flickering against the walls. Slowly, deliberately, she unbuttoned her uniform. The fabric had once meant honor, purpose, identity. Now it felt heavy, like a skin that no longer fit. She slid it off her shoulders, folded it once, then again, and set it at the foot of the cot. She stood there for a moment in borrowed clothes, a plain shirt, trousers too big, and breathed. Outside, the desert hummed with insects. The war felt far away. So did home. She lay down and pulled the blanket up, clutching it like she had on the first night. But this time her grip loosened. She was no longer holding on out of fear. She was holding on because she was still here. It was a Sunday, or at least close enough to call it one. Time blurred in the heat and the dust, but the men still tried to keep rhythm with the world they once knew. They had finished their chores early, brushed the horses, fixed the gate that had been sagging for a week. That evening, someone pulled out the old record player, its leather case scuffed from years of travel. It crackled to life with the sound of Benny Goodman, faint and warbling, like a voice returned from the past. The bunkhouse porch became the gathering place. A pot of stew simmered over the fire. Someone uncorked a bottle of whiskey and passed it around with little ceremony. Shirts were tucked in, hats dusted off, boots polished just enough to count. There were no women to impress, only each other, and maybe the ghosts they still carried. She watched from a distance. Her body leaned against the post at the far end of the fence, wrapped in dusk and curiosity. Her hair, now tied back in a soft braid, caught the breeze. She didn't step closer. Not yet. But she didn't walk away either. That in itself was a kind of arrival. Then Levi stood up. He was the youngest, and maybe the boldest in that way only youth allows. He walked across the dirt with slow, even steps. No swagger, no demand, just an open palm extended gently toward her, the music curling behind him like a thread between worlds. She looked at his hand, then at his eyes, then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. She stepped forward. It wasn't graceful. The boots she wore were too big, and he wasn't much of a dancer. They moved in slow circles, feet dragging slightly in the dirt. But they didn't stumble. They didn't speak. Around them, the others went quiet. Not in mockery, but in reverence. Because everyone understood what was happening wasn't courtship. It was something deeper. It was reclamation, of dignity, of body, of presence. Her hands, once trained to tie tourniquets and hold trembling soldiers, now rested lightly on someone else's shoulders. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She wasn't being watched by guards. She wasn't fighting to survive. She was dancing. The song changed, and they kept moving. Another cowboy joined with a partner made of broomsticks. Laughter broke the tension. Hank tapped a spoon against his tin cup in time with the beat. Soon, a few of them tried to outdo each other with silly steps. She laughed, out loud, and when she did, Levi's smile broke open wide. After a while, the music slowed. The record crackled to its end. Plates were scraped clean. The fire died to embers. The stars crept over the desert sky like glittering witnesses. She sat alone near the fence again, arms around her knees. But something had shifted. She wasn't outside the circle anymore. She was part of the memory being made. And when Hank passed by to gather dishes, she looked up and gave him a smile. Small, tired, but whole. She had danced, not for them, for herself. If you're enjoying this story, like the video and comment below where you're watching from, we'd love to hear your thoughts. The orders arrived without ceremony, folded into a stiff envelope that smelled of ink and bureaucracy. The war had been over for a long time, long enough for the dust to settle into habits, long enough for laughter to return in cautious bursts. But paper has a way of ending things that feelings cannot. Hank read it once, then again, jaw tight, before handing it to Levi. No one spoke. The words did the speaking for them. Transfer, Federal Repatriation Center, processing and return. She did not need a translation. She understood enough now, enough to read their faces. The news moved through the camp like a slow wind. No one argued, no one cursed. There was nothing to fight. This was not an enemy to circle or a storm to outride. It was an ending, clean and unavoidable. Jimmy kicked at the dirt. Levi folded the paper back into the envelope with care that felt almost tender. Hank stared out toward the hills, squinting as if the sun had suddenly grown too bright. She listened. She nodded. She bowed her head slightly. She had known, somewhere inside herself, that this place was borrowed time, safe but temporary. Still, the weight of it settled heavy in her chest. This was the moment she had been trained for: departure, separation, endurance. Yet it felt nothing like the drills back home. There was no pride in it, only loss. She packed quietly. There was not much to gather. She chose carefully, each item weighed by meaning rather than need. The blanket came first, the same one placed beside her in the dust on that first day. It had been mended twice, still smelled faintly of smoke and sun. The pencil followed, worn short, its wood chewed from nervous habits she no longer needed. The tin cup, dented, imperfect, went in last. She left the uniform folded on the cot, left the books stacked neatly by the wall, left the music box where it belonged, on Hank's shelf. Outside, the men pretended to busy themselves. Saddles were adjusted, a fence post straightened for no reason. One of the horses was brushed again, though its coat already shone. No one wanted to be the first to say goodbye. When the truck arrived, its engine rattling against the quiet, the desert seemed to hold its breath. She stepped out with her small bundle in her arms. The sun was high, unforgiving, just like the day she had arrived. But everything else was different. Levi stepped forward first. He held out a small object, a locket, brass, dulled with age. Inside was a photograph of his mother as a young woman, smiling beside a tree. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. She took it with both hands, pressed it to her forehead, then closed it carefully and tucked it into her pocket. Jimmy came next. He handed her a photograph, a horse standing proud against an open sky, muscles taut, eyes bright. "So you don't forget," he said, voice rough. She smiled at that, a real smile. She would not forget. Hank waited until last. He didn't offer an object. He offered a nod, the same nod he had given on the first day when the world had narrowed to dust and fear. She returned it. No words passed between them. None were needed. The truck door opened. She climbed in, her bundle on her lap. The engine growled. For a moment she looked back at them, at the men who had smelled of leather and tobacco, who had taught her words and given her silence, who had not saved her but had seen her. Then the truck pulled away. The desert stretched out before her, endless and bright. Behind her, the camp shrank into memory. No one waved. They stood still until the dust swallowed the road. It was over. And yet, as the miles passed, she realized something unexpected. She was not leaving empty-handed. She was carrying something no order could take away. She was carrying herself. It arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between catalogs and feed invoices, with foreign stamps curling at the edges. The envelope was thin but carried weight, the kind of weight that made Hank, long retired from writing, sit down on the porch bench before opening it. The return address was Tokyo. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, unfamiliar, and yet strangely known. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a woman in a white coat, clean lines, crisp collar, surrounded by a ring of children in uniforms. Her hair was neatly tied back. She stood tall, hands folded in front of her, eyes calm but not cold. Behind her, a building with a red cross above the door. A clinic, maybe a school. In the children's faces there was laughter. In hers there was something else. Peace. On the back of the photograph, one line in English. 5 words. "Thank you for showing me I could live." Hank didn't speak. He didn't call for anyone. He just held the picture for a long time, the edges fluttering slightly in the dry breeze. The desert stretched around him, unchanged, but inside him something moved. Quiet, like a horse's breath at sunrise. They hadn't known what became of her. After she left, life went on. The war faded into stories, medals tucked in drawers, photographs yellowing on mantels. New hands came to work the ranch. The bunkhouse was rebuilt after a storm tore half the roof away, but some things were never replaced. The music box stayed where it was. The locket remained in Hank's desk. No one dared to open the cot by the corner window, and then, years later, the letter. In post-war Japan, she had returned to a world of ruin and rubble. Her village was gone. The ashes had been swept into roads. But she did not disappear. She studied, she rebuilt, she worked among children, orphans, wounded, abandoned, and became the kind of woman no military had trained her to be. A caretaker, a healer. They called her sensei, teacher, doctor. Sometimes both. She taught more than medicine. She taught the children how to hold a spoon, how to say thank you, how to draw birds. Somewhere in the folds of her life, she had found the pieces that once shattered across that desert camp, and instead of burying them, she had built something new. The photograph never left Hank's pocket after that day. Folded carefully, wrapped in wax paper, he didn't show it to many, just the ones who knew, the ones who were there. Jimmy saw it once and said nothing, only tipped his hat. Levi cried, but said it was the wind. Years later, when Hank passed, the photograph was found in his coat, still warm from the sun, still whole. The story was never written in history books. It wasn't a battle. No medals were awarded, no generals named. But it mattered, because sometimes the war ends not with surrender, but with a hand extended in the dirt, with a spoon offered, a song played, a dance accepted, and a life lived, fully, fiercely, because someone once chose not to hate. If this story moved you, please like the video and drop a comment below with where you're watching from. These stories deserve to be remembered.